Welcome, everybody. My name is Tarek Masoud. I'm the faculty director of the Middle East Initiative, and it's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Tahir Kilavuz, who will be speaking about the roots of elite cooperation, coalition building under authoritarianism and democratic transition in the Middle East and North Africa. Tahir is a postdoctoral fellow at the Middle East Initiative this year at the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School. He completed his doctorate last year at the University of Notre Dame, and he is of Turkish origin. And I have to say that Tahir is one of the most interesting, deeply learned thinkers that we've had the pleasure of having in the now 6 years of this program. Tahir is, usually when you have scholars of the Middle East, they are, like myself, expert in one country, and then they know a little bit about some other countries. But Tahir really is a genuine expert on a variety of countries. He's the first person I look to, for example, when I want to understand what's going on in Turkey, and he's the first person I look to when I want to understand what's going on in Algeria. And he even tries to tell me what's going on in Egypt, and although I'm not 100% sure he's right, I still find his views to be enormously interesting and informed. Tahir next year will be returning back to his country to teach at Marmara University. And we're really thrilled that we had the pleasure of having this really distinctive intellect with us this year. So Tahir is going to speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a good 20 minutes for a robust discussion of his very important work afterwards. So if we were all in the same physical space right now, we would clap for you, but what's left for me to do is just to turn it over to you, Tahir. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks a lot, Tarek, especially for your kind words. I hope I can match what you say about me here. But yeah, thanks a lot. So welcome everyone. My presentation today is about opposition coalitions in the Middle East, as Tarek said, and I'm trying to explain how opposition coalitions that were formed under authoritarian regimes later on can be helpful to build a democratic system. I will start my presentation with 3 different perspectives from 3 politicians in 3 countries in the Middle East. First is Ali Belhaj. Ali Belhaj is an Islamist leader in Algeria. He was number 2 of the Islamic Salvation Front, the FIS, in Algeria in early 90s. He was imprisoned during the transition process in Algeria. And once the transition process broke down, he spent his time in prison for some time, and then he still banned from politics. One thing about Ali Belhaj was that he was he was a staunch figure. He had a very harsh rhetoric about the seculars in Algeria at that time. And one interesting thing about him is that he actually spent some time in prison along with several seculars. In 1985, he was in the same prison with some secular activists, whom also became very important figures in Algerian politics later on. 30 years later, when I interviewed him, I asked him about that encounter in prison and said, like, you were the victims of the same regime, you were in the prison at the same time. Didn't you even talk? Like, didn't you discuss the issues that you share together? And he said, well, Islamists wanted Islam, secularists wanted secularism. We were all different. We had nothing to discuss. So this was one perspective about Islamist secularist divide and how it was perceived. The second figure is Ayman Noor, the leader of the Ghad party in Egypt. He was also a presidential candidate. He's a liberal. He was a presidential candidate, and he was one of the important figures in Egyptian transition between 2011 and 13. He was known to be one of the secular liberal actors who tried to cooperate with Islamists. But when he reflected on the transition period, he said, we knew the things that we were against, which was the regime, but we didn't know what we wanted together. So the Islamists and liberals and socialists did not have a vision on how the future of Egypt would be. And then the third name is Mustafa Marzouki, the former president of Tunisia, the first president after the first free and fair elections following the Tunisian revolution. When he talks about the relationship between seculars and Islamists in Tunisia, he says, between us, there was trust, friendship, and personal relationships, and all these things played a big role when we tried to complete the democratic transition. So these are three different political figures from different backgrounds, and they have different views about Islamist secular relations. And here I'm actually trying to understand what created these different views. So why do these opposition actors have different opinions about working together in times of transition, and how this affects the transition process? So in the literature, there has always been this discussion about the role of cooperation during transitions. So they say the cooperation is crucial at times of transitions, but I'm trying to understand how. How was this cooperation during transitions possible in the Middle East? So trying to understand what made cooperation possible can also give us some ideas about the outcomes of democratic transitions as well. And my main argument in a nutshell is that if opposition actors can establish an ideational opposition coalition under the authoritarian regime, they can develop certain resources which help them to have credible commitments to each other. And that credible commitment can help them to cooperate during times of transitions, which can lead to a successful transition outcome. So I will circle back to this argument throughout this presentation. So as I mentioned, the literature talks about the role of cooperation during transitions. Going back to the third wave democratization in Latin America and Eastern Europe, the argument is that if opposition actors and regime actors can cooperate, they can negotiate, and they can bargain, they can find ways to build a democratic system, and that is a crucial way to complete a successful transition. And the same argument was made for the Arab context as well, especially for the Tunisian transition. So these arguments are good, and I agree with that argument as well, but there are certain shortcomings with that argument. Most importantly, these arguments look at just the contingent interaction between different political actors. So they look at what they do at the moment of transition and trying to explain everything based on that. However, with looking at that contingent interaction, they also use slippery concepts, and this is usually descriptive more than analytical. So they don't necessarily make a association between X to Y, point X to point Y, like this leads to this kind of an association. And also it's kind of too obvious that yes, if actors cooperate, they can actually bargain and have transition. So this is a bit too obvious. I'm trying to resolve these issues mainly with two strategies. One is to unpack the relative actors' preferences. So understanding the actors and understanding what they want and why they act in certain ways is crucial to resolve some of the problems with these arguments. And secondly, I'm trying to look at the roots of cooperation. So that I'm looking at the factors that happened beforehand so that we can understand the cooperation patterns and transition outcomes. So during transitions, there are multiple actors in pretty much every case, but focusing on the Middle Eastern case, we have certain set of actors. And we should keep in mind that regardless of what we think about them, these are strategic and rational actors. Yes, they have certain prejudices, they have certain motives, but they try to reach certain goals, and they do this strategically. That is why they make dynamic calculations all the time. And these actors, broadly speaking, in the Middle East context are three groups. One is the Islamist opposition, the second is the secular opposition, and the third is the authoritarian regime, at least in the context of the cases that I'm going to talk about. And these authoritarian regimes, even though they have certain aspects of religious authority as well, they are ideologically more secular authoritarian regime, which also affects the relationship between these three groups. And keep in mind that in each of these groups, there are multiple parties or multiple movements, but these are three broad groups. And even though the existing literature talks about the cooperation between opposition and the regime, I think there should be first a cooperation between different opposition actors, especially considering the differences between Islamist and secular opposition. First, they need to resolve the issues between themselves so that they can be a pretty much united front against the regime so that they can negotiate better. So there are two levels of cooperation, which is why the cooperation between different opposition groups is paramount. But this is quite difficult. I mean, looking at the history of Islamist secular groups in the Middle East, we can say that the coalitions are quite rare. I mean, there have been coalitions, there have been events of cooperation, but they have been rare. Why is this the case? The most important thing is that there are a lot of uncertainties and lack of information between these groups. And because of these uncertainties and lack of information, specifically secularists are quite hesitant to work with Islamists. First of all, there is an uncertainty about Islamist strength. There are arguments about a potential Islamist advantage, meaning that if there are free and fair elections, Islamists would win. And because of that uncertainty, secularists are a bit hesitant about working with Islamists for democratization. That can help them to win. Second, there is uncertainty and lack of information about the Islamist motives and intentions. Because Islamists, at least during the 90s and early 2000s, most of them had the argument about an Islamic state. And even though it was not really fleshed out, it wasn't clear what it was, there was this argument. And the regimes used this argument pretty well as well, and they created this specter of Islamists, creating a threat or a fear of Islamists. And with the lack of information, this actually captured the secularists as well, which made them which make it more difficult to cooperate. And there is also a risk of in-group punishment. Since these groups are very different, when a member of your group can reaches out the other group, there is always a risk of in-group punishment. They are seen as potential traitors, they are accomplices of the other group, and this is a potential threat. So as a result, because of these uncertainties and lack of trust, especially for secularists, working with Islamists comes with significant costs. So benefits might be there, and I argue that benefit is potentially a democratic transition, but the benefits are uncertain. The costs are very high and benefits are uncertain, which is why at the times of transitions, both groups are hesitant to work together, but seculars are specifically more hesitant to work together, which is why in some cases they even work with the regime who are also secular authoritarian, because the motives and incentives of the Islamists are unclear. So yes, there are these hurdles, but then why would actors cooperate if there are such high hurdles for cooperation? So they cooperate if they believe that the outcome is better than the status quo. if the situation will provide them better circumstances than the current situation, then they can cooperate. But by itself, it is not easy because they also need to know the other side would not shirk. They need to see credible commitment from the other side as well. So if I am taking certain risks and taking certain actions, despite the costs, I need to know that you are going to do the same thing. You're not going to betray me, or you're not going to shirk. So this is why the credible commitment is quite important. And I argue that this credible commitment is quite difficult to build during a time of transition, because the rules of the game change, everything is quite fast. It is very difficult if you're not prepared for that situation before. This is why we need to focus on what happens before the transition. So the pre-transition process, the process under authoritarian regime is important to facilitate that credible commitment. And I argue that opposition coalition building under authoritarianism is the way to build that credible commitment. But we need to make a distinction here because there are different kinds of opposition coalitions in the Middle East. We see the kind that is called strategic coalition a lot. Usually groups come together for a protest or maybe single electoral alliance, but these are very short-term, not many things involved for those kind of coalition building. But when it is an ideational coalition building, groups come together, they discuss different issues, different ideological issues, and they try to find ways and agree on certain points. And this takes a long time. So ideational coalition building is different than the other forms. What happens if actors have an ideational coalition building? At the end of this process of coalition building, they can actually develop 3 resources. The first is organizational capital. This refers to very basic things like personally knowing the people on the other side. Like if I'm a secularist, how many Islamist politicians or activists do I know? Or very basic things like, if I'm an Islamist, how many phone numbers from secular politicians do I have? If there is a problem, are there channels to reach them easily, call them or meet them easily? Or we're just unknown figures to each other? The second is trust. If different groups work together against the regime for a couple of years, if they have secret meetings, hiding from the police together, they can actually develop trust and they can believe that they can do the things together in the future as well. And the third is a shared vision. Especially when the coalition is ideational, they can discuss different issues and they can build a vision together for the future of their country. And these 3 can create the credible commitment that can lead to cooperation later on. So this is my argument in a nutshell. Different opposition groups can come together. They can either not form any coalition, but they can form a non-ideational opposition coalition. In that situation, there is not much trust and shared vision and no credible commitment at the end. But if they form an ideational opposition coalition under authoritarian regime, they can develop organizational capital, trust, and a shared vision, which can lead into credible commitment during transition, and which can also lead to cooperation at the end. So with these opposition coalitions, how do these resources affect Islamists and secularists? First of all, when the regimes create this image of Islamists, who are the actors trying to destroy the whole system, when there are no relations, there are not many incentives for Islamists to change that image either. They are not really looking for other groups. They are looking to their own base. And that base can take that discourse as well, so they don't have incentives. But if Islamists work with other groups, then they have incentives to signal a different image than the image that the regimes propose as well. At the same time, these kind of ideological discussions lead to internal debates and within Islamist circles as well. And this can even take them to more moderation in certain cases. And at the end, Islamists become more open to compromise. They can evaluate and understand which points that they can compromise to work with the other groups. This is a learning process, and this happens at the end. And for seculars, we can actually see that those problems that I mentioned at the beginning can disappear. First of all, they can get to know Islamists, which help them to see beyond the image of the specter of Islamists. They can understand that these are just other strategic actors. They have different worldviews than ours, but they also have strategic actors, and they can compromise. Also, the uncertainties and motives about the motives can diminish as well. So yes, maybe some of them are true, but not all of them are true. So they can understand the incentives better. And as a result, the perceived costs of working with Islamists diminish as well. So benefits become more attainable, and costs diminish to some extent. And as a result, seculars can see Islamists as potential allies for the future. And when transition time comes, this can actually be quite helpful. So where does my argument fall in this general literature? Especially after the Arab uprisings, there have been very good studies trying to explain different transition outcomes in the Middle East. Some of them focus on structural factors such as socioeconomic development and civil society, and Tarek is one of the people who proposed that argument. Some of them look at cultural factors like the level of education or secularism in Tunisia. Some arguments look at institutional factors like the role of the army, and others look at some actor-specific factors. So I have disagreements with some of these arguments, but I also agree with some of the points about socioeconomic development and role of the army. We can discuss those in the Q&A if you want. But I argue that these factors, these especially structural and institutional factors, are more distant factors. They probably have an impact on transition outcomes and even on coalition building. However, by themselves, without coalition building, they may have fallen short. So the approximate factor of coalition building is the key between those distant factors and the outcome. So there might be an endogeneity concern here. However, I argue that there is a standalone effect of opposition coalitions that can be built on the effect of the factors from other arguments. And I'm trying to show this standalone effect of opposition coalitions with two pieces of evidence. One is case studies based on fieldwork data that I collected in Algeria, Egypt, and Tunisia. And the second is survey experiments, specifically showing the standalone effect of resources of opposition coalition and trying to link the coalitions to cooperation outcomes. So first I'm going to go over the case studies. So as I mentioned, in this study, I actually look at 3 cases, but here in this presentation, I'm just going to focus on Tunisia. Just to give a general sense, Algeria and Egypt were 2 other transition attempts in the recent history, but they both failed. The important thing is, in the Algerian case, there was no coalition building before the transition. And in Egyptian case, there were some attempts of coalition building, but they were not ideational coalitions. And throughout the process, they failed. If you want, we can discuss those cases in the Q&A. But in Tunisia, especially with the experience of October 18 collective, the coalition building around that, help the actors to develop certain resources to help them during the transition. So the story in Tunisia actually starts back in 2003. You can take it to the earlier, but the main coalition building story starts in 2003 in Aix-en-Provence in southern France. In 2003, a group of activists, mainly from CEPER, the political party, convened this conference, bringing together different political activists from different groups. There were leftists, there were liberals, there were even socialists, and there were Islamists as well. And this was pretty much the first time since late 80s that Islamists and different secular groups came together around a table. And for 3 days, they had this conference and they released a 12-point declaration at the end. This was a very basic conference, but it was quite symbolic. And the declaration was quite symbolic as well, especially bringing these groups together. And this photo is quite interesting because even though this photo was taken in 2003, there are many important figures of the Tunisian transition here. You can see the president of the first post-revolution Tunisia, the parliament speaker, 5 or 6 ministers, and then a couple of members of parliament and activists during transition time. So 8 years before the transition, the process actually started to some extent. But even though this happened and there were some other activities in Europe, especially meetings between leaders, the main coalition building process took place within Tunisia. And October 18 Collective was the main process. On October 18, 2005, Tunisia had a UN information summit. And the dictator Zine El Abidine Ben Ali tried to use this as an opportunity to reflect a good image of the regime that is open to the world. And they paid quite attention to that. But the Tunisian opposition wanted to take advantage of the situation as well. They wanted to show the repression of the regime, and they discussed different ways to do that. And eventually, they decided to have a hunger strike. And 8 activists from 4 different political parties and 4 different civil society organizations got together and started a hunger strike on October 18, 2005. Here, the 8 sit-in people are the 8 activists, the hunger strikers. Again, there were Islamists, there were leftists, there were liberals there. And these were important figures. The Najib Shadbi, the leader of PDP, Hama Hamami, the leader of the Socialist Workers' Party, and then number 2 of CPR, Abdul Ayadi, a member of Ennahda, Islamist Ennahda, Samir Dilo, and other activists. So this was important because for a month, they lived together and they actually attracted quite attention during the hunger strike. Every day, people came to visit them and showed solidarity. At the end of a month, they realized that they actually have a momentum that they can build something on. And they decided to turn this hunger strike into an opposition coalition, into a collective. So about a month later, they had the first meeting of this collective and they officially founded the October 18 Collective. The collective had about 25 members with change in numbers from different groups, including these 8 members, but at the same time, there were some other important members as well. And they were also joined by At-Takattul, which was another important party, important opposition at that time, which became quite important during the transition as well. And after they founded this opposition coalition, for the following 3-4 years, they met regularly, monthly if possible, but sometimes the intervals were larger. And they met regularly and they discussed the main problems of Tunisia. They tried to understand what their main purpose was and how they agree on certain principles. And at the end of these 4 years, they agreed on 3 texts. One was about pluralism, one was about religion and politics, and one was about the women's rights. All these groups that were in this collective signed the declarations, the texts, documents on these 3 main issues. And they said, we are going to agree on having a democratic Tunisia that is secular, but respecting the religion, and at the same time, given rights to women. And at the end of this, this process and the signed declarations, they published this book, which a very telling name, Tariqna ila Demokratiya, Our Path Toward Democracy. And the subtitle is actually quite interesting because it says, summary of the national discussions between Islamists, leftists, nationalists, and liberals for common Tunisian vision on democratic state. So this book was published only months before the revolution. I nowhere argue that this had any impact on revolution, but that prepared the elites to what was going to happen after the revolution as well. So they were quite prepared. How? They derived certain resources with the experience of coalition building. First of all, they developed organizational capital. Ayesha Hamami, one of the strikers of October 18 and the current Minister of Human Rights in Tunisia today, he says, our relations became deeper. In the personal level, we became even friends, even though we have political conflicts. So they got to know each other, which was quite important. And Marzouki, the former president, points out the trust among them. They said, after working together for years, we actually got to know them and we started trusting them. And another socialist member of the collective says, it was quite difficult to agree on those texts. And we all had very hard discussions. It wasn't easy. It took 3-4 years, but we all compromised. And he says, Islamists compromised more, but everyone compromised to some extent. And we agreed on those things. So we developed a shared vision at the end of this process. So they had an organizational capital, trust, and a shared vision at the end. And we can see the impact of these resources and the experience pretty much in different stages of the transition. First of all, the formation of the Troika government. After the first free and fair elections in Tunisia, 3 different parties, Ennahda, Seper, and Takattul, came together and formed a coalition government. There were different reasons for this government, but it was possible for Ennahda to find other parties and for Takattul and Seper not to work with Ennahda, but they decided to work together as the 3 winning parties of the elections. And here you can see the leaders of these 3 parties. And when we look at what they say about the formation of the government, we can see that they all point to their past experience. Rashid Ghannouchi, the leader of Ennahda, says, we didn't have to look for common grounds, common ideational grounds for democratization, because we had all our conflicts and found the common grounds. So he says, we were ready for that when it came. And Mustafa bin Jafar, the leader of Takattul, he says, we didn't have to force ourselves to work with Islamists. It was a natural situation because we had already worked with them for years. And Marzouki takes the story to the beginning and in a flashy way, he says, actually the beginning of Troika government was the Aix-en-Provence conference in 2003. So they all point out what they had in the past. The second important step was the completion of the constitution. So the constitution writing process was quite arduous. So it was quite difficult. It had very many ups and downs. Sometimes these actors tried to step back, but at the end, they found a common solution. And during that time, there were different initiatives of dialogue, and the national dialogue was important as well, but the completion of constitution was done through 2 different initiatives. One was what is called Dar Diafa dialogue, and the second one was the consensus committee. Specifically in both of these cases, the main actors were the actors from the October 18 collective. In Dar Diafa dialogue, along with the Troika government parties, Al-Jumhuri, the changed name of the PDP, was one of the leading groups, and they actually resolved most of the contentious issues in the constitution in that dialogue. At least this is what the actors, the constitution writer actors argue. And then in the consensus committee in the parliament, they agreed on those principles, and they pretty much finalized the constitution to leave the signature until the first stage of the national dialogue. And the actors also argue that we can see the impact of October 18 on the constitution as well. According to Samir Dilo, one of the strikers of October 18, if it wasn't for the October 18 and the documents that agreed on, writing of the constitution would take probably much longer and it would be more difficult. And keep in mind that it was supposed to be completed in a year and it took much longer than that. And he argues that without those, it would be much longer. And the third step was the national dialogue. And admittedly, there was no direct impact of the October 18 collective on this process, but there were some indirect impact, which I'm going to pass right now because of time, but we can discuss these in the Q&A if you want. So after covering the case of Tunisia to show how the experience of October 18 collective affected the outcome of transition, now I'm focusing on the mechanisms through survey experiments. And I do that based on two original surveys that I conducted. One is a survey in Tunisia with elites, mainly with civil society and party members. And these were face-to-face surveys with about 250 respondents. But the downside is, even though this was with the elites, the survey took place after the transition. So it is possible for them to develop certain different ideas after the transition. And the second survey I conducted was a survey in Algeria, which was last year in 2019. This was an online survey because there was a national protest movement in Algeria, which is still going on, the Hirak. And it was not possible to do a face-to-face survey, so we conducted an online survey. And I've mainly focused on the protesters to understand the mechanisms, because even though protesters are not the same with organized elites, those are the closest group that I could find. So I tried to survey the protesters during a time of potential transition. And in these surveys, I'm mainly focusing on the heterogeneous effects. What do I mean by that? I focus on how do the treatments in my experiments change the perception on Islamists. Because remember the beginning of my theory, I argue that especially the secular actors have certain barriers to work with Islamists. And I'm trying to understand how is it possible to bring down those barriers to some extent to work with Islamists. So I have two experiments. One is an experiment looking at the issue of trust. And this experiment was conducted both in Tunisian and Algerian surveys. So here, the basic design of the experiment. So I have this control group, which I talk about only the organizational capital. So I give them a scenario and I say, suppose that there's a disagreement between your group and a distant party. And by distant party, I use a group that they defined in a different question. So it might be an Islamist party, liberal party, leftist party, etc. So suppose that there's a disagreement between your group and a distant party, and you have worked with a member from that party in a previous dispute. How likely for you to work together with the members of that party to find a resolution for the interest of Tunisian or Algerian people? And in the treatment group, I include just a phrase and say, so you had this previous dispute and you worked together, but that was successfully resolved and you established trust between you. So I'm trying to remember that this experience established trust between them. And I'm asking how likely for them to work together. Of course, keep in mind that priming someone with trust and then asking cooperation are actually quite similar. Like I'm giving them a treatment that is close to the outcome, which is why I'm actually focusing on the heterogeneous effect, not the general effect. So if this treatment has different impact on different groups, then we can actually argue that this is beyond the design. So here are my results. First, you can look at this left-hand side panel. Above the Tunisian experiment and below the Algerian experiment results. If the distant group is any of the non-Islamist groups. I pool them together, priming the actors with trust, which is the blue line. Priming them does not really change their expectations of working with them together. However, if the other group, if the distant group is Islamist, first of all, they are less likely to work with them. And second, if there is trust that was established before, they become more likely to work with Islamists. And the same thing can be seen in the Algerian case. On the right-hand side, I am unpacking this non-Islamist group and showing different groups. And here, in different groups, you can't really see a positive impact of the treatment, but we can see that only in Islamist here and here, and in Algerian survey to some extent for nationalists as well. But here, what I'm trying to say, if secular actors if they develop trust with Islamists, they become more likely to work with them. And this doesn't work in the same way with other groups. So this heterogeneous effect show that how this trust can actually help them to overcome certain barriers. So after this experiment, I'm turning to a second experiment because this was a more simple experiment. So I wanted to bring all the resources together and design the second experiment, which is a factorial conjoint experiment. It's not a very complex experiment. It is a mini conjoint, I would say. But I'm bringing together all the resources. And unlike the first experiment, just talking about trust, I'm actually bringing together both negative and positive values together with the advantage of a conjoint experiment. At the end, I have 36 different experimental combinations in my design. And in this design, which I'm going to show you in a second, I also have a treatment about in-group punishment. Because remember in my argument, I talked about in-group punishment. So I wanted to see the impact of in-group punishment as well. So here is my design. It is very similar to the first one, but it is a bit more complex. Suppose that you're a local politician in your city and there's a disagreement between your group and another rival group. The members of that group are, again, distant group, interaction, trust, and vision. These are treatments that I'm going to explain. How likely is it for you to work with them to find a resolution for the interest of your city and then the punishment treatment? And I only conducted this experiment in the Algerian survey with about 220 protesters, which is a very small. And also I should say that in the first experiment, the number of respondents were quite small as well. So finding positive results, significant results in heterogeneous effects was important. So in this conjoint experiment, in these 4 different attributes that I have, I'm basically giving them different levels of organizational capital, trust, shared vision, and punishment. So for interaction, I tell them either you haven't worked together or you worked together many times. For trust, I tell them they don't trust or trust them. For vision, I tell them you have different views on political matters because these are distant groups. But as a treatment, I tell them, but you agree on certain principles with them. And then for punishment, for certain categories, I remind them that working with the distant group can be seen as a betrayal from their own side. So just to put them together, I show you as a sample vignette. So one of the combinations would be, suppose that you're a local politician in your city and there's a disagreement between your group and another rival group. The members of the group are Islamists. So this is one example. You work together once, you don't trust them, and you have different views on political matters, but agree on certain principles. So how likely is it for you to work together with them to find a resolution for you, even though it is seen as a betrayal by some people from your group? So this is a sample vignette that what people could see. And in the results, here I'm just going to focus on shared vision because we are running out of time. So I'm bringing together the impact of shared vision, especially when there is a risk of in-group punishment. So on the left-hand side, first, this is if the distant group is a non-Islamist group. whether there is an in-group punishment or not, there is no significant difference between a shared vision treatment or not. But if the distant group is Islamists, when they are reminded that there might be an in-group punishment, there is a very significant decline. So they don't want to work with Islamists if they are going to be punished by that. But if they have a shared vision with those Islamists, this effect is negated. So pretty much the costs that I mentioned at the beginning are negated by the potential benefits of working with them. So this effect is mainly shown in Islamists and not the other ones. So this shows that in a very small sample, given a treatment on a trust or a shared vision can actually help seculars to work with Islamists more likely than the others. So in a nutshell, based on the case studies that I have and the experiments that I conducted, yes, first of all, I agree that cooperation is quite crucial for a successful transition, but looking at only cooperation during transition is not enough. We have to look at the roots of that cooperation, and these roots can be found in the coalition building process under authoritarianism. And if we can say something about the opposition actors in the Middle East after this point, that would be if they want a democratic transition in their region, in their country in the future, probably they should start investing into that today. Because this is a long-term process. They need to prepare themselves for the future, and probably they need to get to know each other and trust each other for that day to come. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tahir. So we have about, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes for questions. That was a really great talk. And so what we're going to do is all of the people who are on the call right now, you can see that at the bottom of your screen, there's a icon for participants. If you click that, you should get a participant pane that allows you to raise your hand. If you raise your hand, I will call on you in the order in which you raise your hand. But I want to just kind of very quickly abuse my position just to get us all, I think, on the same page with respect to certain things. So first of all, Tahir, I would love it if you could explain a little bit more clearly what exactly is an ideational coalition.
Yes, so what I mean by an ideational coalition is an opposition coalition that different groups come together and actually discuss ideational matters.
Do they have to agree on ideas?
No, no.
So they could come together and discuss the ideas and decide they hate each other?
Well, so if they do that for a long time, if they get to know each other, they may not agree on everything, but they can find certain common grounds.
So there has to be some idea on which this coalition is based. You're not just saying that they have to have positive personal relations with each other. Yeah. You didn't call it like, social capital, bridging social capital. You called it an ideational coalition.
Yes. So it should be more than personal relations.
So what is it?
That ideational aspect does not take place in one day. It takes a long time to agree on. So what is it?
What do they have to agree on?
So an Islamist will be an Islamist after 5 years or after 3 years. A liberal will be a liberal. A socialist will be a liberal. These are not going to change. They will keep their ideas. But they can have certain common points, like building a democracy together.
Right.
Respecting the different views.
So they have to. So you would say. So you would say that an ideational coalition is one in which these different groups have agreed on some minimal set of institutions and have agreed on the prioritizing of democracy above other considerations.
Yes, I mean, especially for this purpose, for democratic transition, that should be about democracy building.
Great.
Remember the text that I mentioned in the Tunisian case?
Yeah.
About pluralism.
Yeah. So then really, how is this argument different from the argument of Scott Mainwaring and Anibal Perez Lignan about how, democracy requires normative commitment to democracy among all of the relevant political actors.
So I don't agree that, I don't think that they necessarily become normatively Democrats. They might be, but not necessarily. I mean, democracy is not, I mean, they argue that you need normative Democrats for democracy building, but I think democracy can be built by non-democrats by heart as well. The condition,
no, but you said they have to agree on something, right?
Well, they can,
and I asked you, what do they agree on? And you said, well, they have to agree on democracy. And so then it's basically that argument, right?
Not really, Tarek. So they should agree on those things. I'm not saying anything about if they believe in those things by heart or not. But agreeing on those things and signing those agreements or given those compromises, the whole process pretty much tie their hands and help them to develop this credible commitment. So they don't become Democrats by heart, but they learn how to play this compromise game and negotiation game.
Yeah. So I think I'm just gonna have to leave it there as a question, like either the ideational coalition is about ideas or it isn't, and I'm still not totally clear on that. Another question is, you're talking a lot about democratic transition, but one might extrapolate from this to democratic consolidation. So is your expectation that you need this kind of ideational coalition for democracies to persist and survive?
Well, I would say my argument would explain democratic transition, but not necessarily democratic consolidation. Democratic consolidation, to me, is another beast. We have seen that in Latin America in 1990s, and we are seeing this in Tunisia today as well. So for the transition, the compromise game was quite crucial, but we see that in the case of Tunisia, they tried to continue that compromise game after 2014-15 as well. And for some people, that compromise game actually undermined the consolidation of Tunisian democracy to some extent, because that did not allow a fair discussion and different views taking place in government. So, I mean, I think there should be a compromise game after that as well, but the dynamics are different. So I wouldn't say that the same strategy would work for democratic consolidation.
Okay, well, so I'm not going to belabor that point, but we're slipping between talking about coalitions to talking about compromise, and Tunisia's democracy is, according to the standard definitions of democratic consolidation, consolidated. Right? I mean, it's past the 2 turnover test or whatever it is. So I think the question of whether this phenomenon that you're identifying is necessary for democracy to survive is one that you should think about. Okay, so that's my first set of questions was really about your key, new social scientific category, which I think we need to kind of get a better handle on. The second set of questions is about the promise in the work to articulate for us some kind of causal story, right? And I felt like the rhetoric outstripped the reality. So I still don't know where this nice thing, this salutary thing called the ideational coalition, where it comes from, right? And so what I was expecting was maybe you would engage with the work of people like, Elizabeth Nugent, for example. So Elizabeth Nugent's new book, she's basically talking about a very close cousin of this. And she's making the argument that when they were put in, when secularists and Islamists were put in jail together, they were more likely to cooperate than when they weren't. And that, of course, is an argument that has a very nice resonance with the argument by Ellen Lust-Oker in her work about divided structures of contestation. So that's one story, which would be that authoritarian regimes manage and manipulate their opposition in a certain way. They either oppress them all together, in which case they form the ideational coalition or are more likely to, or they oppress some and advantage others, in which case you're likely to get the kinds of polarization that Elizabeth Nugent describes. How would you address that? How would you intercede in that argument?
I would not address. I don't necessarily see my argument as a refutation to those arguments. I don't claim that I explain the whole democratization process from independence to democratization in Tunisia or elsewhere. I think my argument is one of the blocks in the whole building blocks of these cases. So I see Elizabeth Nugent's work is the precursor of my argument, because that prepares the conditions to some extent for the opposition coalition, the same way for Ellen Last's work. And I would say the same way for your work as well. I mean, probably the conditions in Tunisia about socioeconomic development and civil society, those were important for this opposition coalition to emerge. What I'm trying to say, these are important factors, but there is also another block that we are missing in between, which is this opposition coalition. So I consider this as a Lego game. So I'm adding a piece.
So you're basically saying, this is a process. There's a process by which you get from the distal causes to the outcome. And in the middle, all of these arguments are hypothesizing some kind of magical thing that happens among the opposition, and I'm going to describe what that is for you.
I would say that. And probably I'm also describing a magical thing here, and probably I'm missing certain things, and those are other parts of this building block.
Right. But I mean, I still think, okay, so let's say, for example, you agree with, let's say, Elizabeth Nugent's argument that when you're all put in jail together, that increases the likelihood that there will be cooperation. You don't think, however, it's deterministic, right? Because in fact, some of your examples, they were in jail together and they hated each other.
Yeah.
So we have so what caused that? Why in one case, the Tunisian case, we got the cooperation, and in the Algerian case, we didn't?
So in general, I don't see social science as deterministic. I prefer to see probabilistic.
Okay, give me a probabilistic story. Yeah.
So yeah, I would say being like repressed by the same regime in the same way increases their likelihood to form that coalition. It didn't happen, even though they were repressed in the same way in Algeria, but it happened in Tunisia. Why? Well, I think we go to the social movements literature in that. For certain movements to emerge, there should be certain opportunities and consequences. So Matt Buehler is here. He also discussed this issue, and he says, well, these opposition coalitions lived in this way and survived in this way, but it is not always clear how they emerged. There are certain conditions that also, like, sometimes you need a nudge for that coalition to emerge. So I think in Tunisian case, the opportunity of the UN summit was the nudge at the end to start that. That's why I don't think it is deterministic. If that didn't happen that day, maybe we wouldn't see an opposition coalition in Tunisia either. Okay,
so I want to stop interrogating you, but everybody can see why I enjoy engaging with you so much. The ideas are so interesting and provocative. So I have several hands up, and I'm just going to go down the list in order. So the first is Professor Matthew Buehler. Welcome, sir. You need to unmute yourself. Oh, wait, you know what? I have to unmute you. Sorry, forgive me.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank
you, Tahir. I really enjoyed your presentation. I had the great honor of actually reading the entire dissertation from front to back as a component of our section work with the MENA APSA section. And so I can say like conclusively that it's a very interesting dissertation and it's very promising, I think, as being a future book. The first thing I wanted to mention to you is, so with Tarek's point about the whole idea of ideational opposition coalitions, I understand what you're getting at there, but really all of your cases are about cooperation between Islamists and leftists or secularists. And really the existing literature on the Middle East is really built around the cooperation between those two groups. So I might reframe the entire project as looking at leftist Islamist coalitions. And in that vein, you're going to want to look more at the work of Janine Clark. She has two articles on the topic in Isthmus and Comparative Politics. Gillian Schwedler, Michelle Browers on Yemen, the Joint Meetings Party, Eva Wagner, my book as well. The second thing, in terms of your, like the opposition relationship, you should look at the work of Jennifer Gandhi. That's really interesting about tipping points and how, like, as the horizon, the future comes, that parties basically withdraw from cooperation because they fear the future. That's a really interesting argument. And then I guess, like, more broadly, I thought your argument was very persuasive. I thought it was very original research. But I think in terms of moving this forward as a publication strategy, in some ways, I think it makes the most sense to write a 3-country comparison that's more kind of a comparative historical analysis piece that might focus mostly on your field work and the interviews, et cetera, and then excise the 2 surveys and publish those separately as articles. And the reason why I say that is the Tunisia survey, perhaps you could include in the book, but the time period isn't really right. I mean, the time period you're really talking about is in the 2000s, right? But this is a survey that was conducted after the transition. The second one, the Algeria survey, which I also thought was very interesting and very original. I mean, there it's really a public opinion survey of the masses, and your book is really about elites. And so I just felt like there was a kind of level analysis problem in terms of the evidence. And of course, I can sympathize that because, you know, when you collect data in 3 different countries, all of your data is never fully parallel, and I totally feel you there. But anyway, this is really excellent work. I'm really happy to see it.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Yeah, I mean, I'm actually building again my argument on the works that you mentioned. I pretty much like go over all of them, but I agree with you that I'm talking about Islamist leftist coalition. I'm not, or Islamist secular coalition. I'm not talking about other ways of opposition coalitions, and that is why my argument probably would not travel the same way for contexts that have different cleavages than an Islamist secularist cleavage. So probably a reframing there would be helpful. I mean, I agree with you about the like potential differences in level of analysis. So ideally, if I was doing the research in 2012, I would do the I would do the survey in Tunisia at that time, and that would be a perfect match. But it wasn't possible. So I tried to do my best with the given conditions. These are concerns, and I'm actually getting some pushback from the referees on that as well. I'm actually considering different options, and one of the options was what you suggested. So I will see how the process goes.
Great. I want to make sure that we get everybody's questions in, or at least as many as possible. So the next is Professor Dina Abdel Qadir. I will unmute you, Professor.
All right. Thank you very much, Tahir, for this wonderful presentation. I just wanted to aim like a macro question, which is basically, if you look at Mark Lynch's work on the Arab Spring, you will find that everybody that contributed to that edited volume is basically tearing their hair apart because of the trend in political science to be able to create grand theory and to generalize. Meanwhile, what they're saying in the book, it's impossible to even regionally generalize. So what do you take from this argument in, creating the structures that you have created? So that's my first question. My second question is, internally, I'm very familiar with pacting theory, and in my opinion, it might not work, is exactly because of lack of trust, as you have pointed out. But you never mentioned the differences in socioeconomic classes, and maybe if you've gotten into Egypt, that would have been a primary issue. You didn't. You mentioned in passing the military and the role of the military, but again, you know, this is of primary importance in countries versus other countries. And then the major component is the international factor. That I find, you know, will those people, even if they want to create coalitions with international interference, is that possible?
Great questions.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. Abdelkader. So first about, by the way, Tarek, do you want to get a couple of questions? And
why don't you just answer this one, you know, particularly the question, frankly, about international influences, which is a critique that could also be leveled, I think, correctly at my own work. I mean, it's something that we're all kind of ignoring.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So about the generalizability issue, I mean, probably like you have seen from my responses to Tarek as well, my purpose, like looking at social science in general, I have certain doubts about determinism and fully generalizability. I think there is a possibility of generalizability given certain context. And what is that is, in different contexts, in different regions, if we can find two salient groups like Islamist or secularist, we can find the basic tenets of the argument and generalize them. Clearly, they are not going to be Islamist and secularist, and the details of the argument will be different. However, in a different context, you can put a Christian Democrat and social democrat in two sides of the coin, and then you can argue similar things about how coalition building can develop certain resources. But the details of the argument cannot be generalizable, so I'm not trying to do that either. About the alternative explanations, I agree. So, so there are certain alternative explanations I can more easily reject, like, I don't know, probably Tunisia being more secular lead into this outcome, I probably reject that easier. But for certain others, I wouldn't flat out reject them. So, but I can still argue certain things. So for socioeconomic development and class relations, yes, Tunisia is more developed and classes are more organized. But at the same time, this may have affected the formation of opposition coalition, but not like, I say that is an indirect effect. So direct effect is still missing. So for example, like when I talk to people from Kifaya, they were like, I was asking them like, why didn't you have these discussions? They didn't say we had like different class relations and we didn't discuss these issues. They said, well, I mean, if we discussed religion and politics, probably we would break apart in one day. So we were afraid we didn't discuss those issues. And they broke apart anyways. About international factors, I guess I agree with that. That is, we, as compared to politics people, we like to focus on domestic issues, and that usually leave the international factors out. In Egypt, definitely the role of international factors was important. And even today, we can see that too. But like, given the international factors, for example, why still there is no strong opposition coalition in Egypt is another question. So like, those things affect and explain to some extent, but they wouldn't by themselves explain the coalition building process entirely.
Great. So, you know, we do only have time for one more question. And I see some questioners here that you can probably engage with offline, but I do want to get this last one from Mohammed Dia Hamami. So go ahead, Muhammad. I'm unmuting you. One second, let me try to get. Yep, go ahead.
Hi. I really actually enjoyed the presentation, especially the empirical facts of the the 2011 period. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah,
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So especially the pre-2011 period, and more importantly, the 2003 conference. We usually talk about the October 18 one, but 2003, I never heard about it myself. And I saw that I actually had one of my professors who were there, Professor Goumeni, was from Nahda. And I think it can be very helpful to explain why after the two first tests, maybe of this coalition after the revolution, went in direction where a part of the secular groups split it and joined the authoritarian people who were in the authoritarian regimes. I'm talking about 2013, when you have people from the PDP or from the Popular Front joining, and that actually I would like to know how that split can be explained by, or Matt, can be explained by your theory. And also there is another test, which was in 2011, when Nahda left the haute instance, the Ashur Commission. It was formed also based on the coalition created in 2000, exactly. So Nahda had disagreement and left that coalition. So we saw that even within the pre-2011 coalition, the Islamist and secular democratic coalition, there were different splits, and until now there is no real cohesion. So how do you explain that?
Yeah,
great question.
We should probably sit at one point and I can tell you all the stories that are very interesting things about these. These are very good. So I can actually explain this with human nature. Those are all human beings. And if you listen to stories, you can see how personalistic ambitions play a role in that. So I should say that this October 18 coalition actually broke apart in 2009, before the revolution. So it broke apart in 2009 elections because Najib Shebbi wanted to become presidential candidate, and Bin Jafar and Marzouki rejected it. And Nahda was in between. And they were like, oh, you don't want me to become presidential candidate, I'm the leader, you are the leader, whatever, and they broke apart. But what I'm trying to say is the impact played on. And in 2011, a couple of days after Ben Ali left, on January 17, I guess, they had a meeting. Like they said, okay, let's discuss if we can do something together as a coalition. And in that meeting, they decided that they all wanted different things. Probably Nahda focused more on bringing Ghannouchi back to the country. As you remember, Najib Shebbi wanted to have a more reformist path. Some others wanted more revolutionary path, and they could not agree on a certain way, specific way, so they could not continue as a coalition. That is why different groups, either PDP or Popular Front, after a way, they left, and their personal differences played a role in that. And second thing is the in-group punishment that I mentioned. In this in-group punishment, I think the biggest target was Hama Hamami from the Popular Front or Workers' Party at that time. Because being a socialist, he was not supposed to work with the Islamists. And he took a lot of fire from 2005 onwards. And once there was no clear agenda after 2011, on top of that, with the pressure from his group, he stopped working with them. Some people argue that Hama was more like open to discussions with different groups, but we don't know. I couldn't meet with Hama Hamami himself. But yeah, like those two played a role. And similarly for Nahda's behavior, this is not like a linear process. It was not like, oh, there was opposition coalition and it led to this outcome. There were so many ups and downs. So many times Nahda or different groups backstepped and they changed their behavior, and at the end they came to an agreement. So there's a whole process we can discuss. Thanks.
Well, this is really tremendous, and I think we could spend endless more hours talking about this. So I think what I said at the very beginning of this talk, testimonial to Dr. Kilavuz's deep knowledge, was more than borne out in the course of this talk. So please join me in thanking Dr. Kilavuz for such a really informative discussion and for giving us a glimpse into this work that I am confident is going to take its place among the most important explanations of democratization in the Arab world or in any part of the world for that matter. So thank you, Tahir.
Thanks a lot, Tarek, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you all for joining. Bye now.